Hello, everybody. Hi, welcome to the lecture. This is a role play lecture series number 3, Better Prep. Hello. Hi, welcome. Have a seat. This is role play lecture series number 3. We're going to talk about preparing for games, whether it's the first session or the 101st session. We're going to talk about what you can do in between games as a game master to feel better prepared and to be ready for those games. This is lecture number 3 in a series of 12 lectures we're going to be doing this year, with an accompanying potential Q&A at the end, depending on how feisty chat is feeling today. And you might be watching this live, in which case, welcome. Or you could be watching this after the fact on our Patreon. Also welcome. I'm Adam Coble. I'm the Roleplay GM, and I'm going to be delivering unto you some advice today on how I prep and some options for how you might also prepare for sessions of your game. Today's lecture is made possible, of course, by support from our patrons over at patreon.com/roleplay. That's you. Thanks. Thank you. So I did a lot of prep for this lecture. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about prepping. So in a role-playing game, in the traditional structures of a role-playing game, the player's job is predominantly to react to what's going on in the world. They're taking actions, they are responding to NPC dialogue, they're overcoming the challenges that are placed before them by the GM. Their responsibility is to answer the question of what do you do? Most of the time, games do not demand any real prep from players, which is why I think you can run into a situation where players only love you when they're playing. Players only pay attention to the game when they're sitting down at the table and they're actually running through the motions of rolling dice and looking at their character sheet and referencing rules. And then the session ends and they close their books and they go out for pizza. And a lot of the time I think that they just don't think about the game in between sessions because most games don't demand prep from the players. Now, I know that every GM that is listening to this is probably thinking, oh, wait, but I have a player at home who is great for this. They do prep. And I think that's the exception rather than the rule, simply because the games that we play don't teach us as players that that's something we're responsible for. The inverse, however, is extremely true for game masters. The idea of prep or GM homework or lonely fun or fronts or a faction turn or whatever you want to call it, whatever your individual game calls it, that is the expectation that gets placed on the game master. Their job in play is to place those challenges in front of the PCs, right, that we talked about, to illustrate the world to the characters and to the players, and to embody it, and to do all of that with a fluidity that implies that nothing is outside of their prep, that we are ready for anything and that we know everything, that GMs are expected to be mythological almanacs of detail, able to fill in any section of the world's great tapestry without any kind of hesitation, which is, of course, impossible. It can't be done. And so that's where prep comes in. What we think of as prep is more often than not an attempt to insulate ourselves from the awkwardness of not having an answer when a player comes to us with a question, right? If a player demands the annual rainfall of the verdant jungles of their character's homeworld, there is an expectation, often an unstated expectation, that we should just know these things off the top of our heads. For the sake of verisimilitude, many games and campaigns operate on the idea that the world is a wholly formed thing and simply not yet revealed by the game master, right? This idea that the game master is a gateway between a world that exists in their mind wholesale, completely formed and finished, and the details of that world pass through the GM to the players, is the common mythology, right? And as a result, prep for the game master often means anticipating player desires, imagining what player questions might be, and being certain that we have, in fact, figured out those details. Prep can cover things like world building, NPC creation, adventure or encounter design, and altogether, GM prep forms a discipline that tracks all the way back to the very earliest parts of the hobby. In a lot of ways, because of that, prep is maps. Traditionally, when we talked about game master preparation, we meant the construction of a dungeon environment, like this one. This is a simple dungeon. I'm sure this didn't take long for a GM to throw together. Now, thankfully, we have tools, and we'll talk about this later on, but we have tools that will help us with this kind of prep, even this most archaic and old school of prep, the prep of the dungeon. It was our job as game masters to populate the dungeon's many rooms and hallways with monsters and treasure and encounters that follow a general and sometimes extremely loose theme. Creating the dungeon was and still is, I think, even in modern versions of Dungeons & Dragons, the foremost sort of prep required of game masters. I think it's the most prep-intensive activity that one is required to undergo when one is running a game. Now, even if you're playing a game in which dungeon crawling is not the predominant gameplay loop, we can extrapolate out from there and look at the idea that a series of adventures might string together into a campaign, and that campaign might cross not only from room to room, but from dungeon to dungeon, each with their own milieu, and our preparation expands with it. So now we're creating towns and cities. We're creating landscape environments that populate the space in between these adventure locations. So now it's our responsibility not only to create the dungeon level, but the world level as well. And if we continue, some games demand prep not only to mean cities and towns, nor simply oceans and forests, but several entire worlds, all populated by their own environments. And this has been around for almost as long as fantasy role-playing has been. Right? Traveller came out in 1977, I think. And in Traveller, part of the game's experience was to do this work, to create worlds and asteroids and deep space in between them. Right? This sort of prep has not gone away. Now, maps of physical locations aren't the only type of map-style prep that we might do. Even in games driven predominantly by non-physical locations, right? Even in a game where we might be able to hand-wave away what rooms make up a building or what buildings make up a town, we still might need relationship maps. Now, the most common type of relationship map is one like this that shows the way that various NPCs and PCs tie together. They might include organizations, but a relationship map can also include concepts, right? Characters can be drawn together by a philosophical concept, and they're all connected in that way. But in the same way, this is a map. This is as much a map as this or this. Right? So depending on the kind of game you're playing, you're going to be creating a map of some sort. Chances are pretty good. Now, I love these maps. I love relationship maps. If you ever watch me do any of my GM prep, I create, I update a relationship map for just about every game that I play. Even a game that isn't so heavily reliant on relationships like Court of Swords in Dungeons & Dragons, I will occasionally create conceptual relationship maps to help me figure out how one thing relates to another. Sometimes maps take the form of linked events, like in this flowchart showing the acts and beats of an adventure in Warhammer Fantasy. You might have seen this one shot that we did. Mouse Guard uses a flowchart style adventure design as well. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about flowcharting and this specific flowchart later on, but this is a form of map prep that I find very useful if you have certain things that you want to occur or expect to occur in a narrative that are plot driven rather than simply character or location driven. So maps all over the place, right? But that's not it. Certainly, you can't just draw a map and expect to be prepared for a game. So there are a few other things that can fall under this umbrella of what makes up Game Master preparation, right? We can design random tables that allow us randomness during play, but the comfort of certainty outside that randomness, right? We prepare to improvise with random tables. We can prep stats, right? Some games demand that we know how many hit points a monster has or what an attack bonus looks like for an NPC. Game objects that require forethought of planning. Sometimes this forethought of planning can be expedited by having NPC stat blocks that are generic, right? So instead of saying this is the prince, it could be like young noble, right? And you can use that young noble stat block for any young noble, right? This is a way that you can do general prep and then tailor it to the specific. But many games demand that we know these things, especially if the PCs are likely to engage mechanically with those characters. Sometimes we need to design custom things for our game, right? Sometimes we are expected to build new items or spells. Sometimes we want to design entire new classes to fit the setting that we've built. And sometimes we want to adjust the core stuff of the game. Sometimes we want to really put on our game designer hat and change, for example, the XP system of a game. That's a form of prep as well, right? All of this stuff falls under prep. Maps of various sorts, and then a bunch of other little bits and pieces. And I'll show you some tools later that you can use instead of drawing a map and instead of unstructured notes that can help you create a more cogent play experience at the table. Now, one thing that I think gets a lot less attention as a prep model than it should, something that is sort of the unsung hero of game prep, is inspiration, right? Prep is more than just maps. It's more than just tools that the game gives us, more than just stats. Going to the movies can be prep. Listening to an album that you've never heard before can be prep. Watching a live stream of somebody else's game, painting a picture, eating food you've never eaten before, all of that can be prep, right? Anything that can get your brain going in a creative way can add something to your campaign. And I feel it's very important to stress this because it can be really easy to get tunnel vision, right? To think, okay, to be prepared, to make a good campaign, I need to read the Dungeon Master's Guide 16 times. I need to internalize all the rules of this role-playing game, and I need to experience the game only through the tools the game gives me. But I've said this before, and I'm sure I will say it multiple times throughout the rest of these lectures. A well-read person is a better GM. Someone who has immersed themselves in culture is a better GM. Learning about the world around you and existing in it as a curious person is a form of prep, right? Whatever things might fire up your particular brain, whether they are related to the campaign you are running or not, can be valid and useful. Let me give you a quick example for me. So I visited Japan recently. And if you watch Court of Swords, you know that Court of Swords is inspired heavily by Eastern philosophy and religion, particularly South Asian and Southeast Asian. But I visited Japan, and I went to a museum there. And all I could think about as I wandered around in the museum was how interesting a real human culture was. Seeing the various wanderings of Buddhism through Indian and Chinese and Japanese culture, I couldn't help but think how much interesting stuff there is in the world that we live in. And that was so inspiring for me in Court of Swords. It gave me a ton of new ideas. And this isn't just about lifting things wholesale, though it certainly can be. It's just about being around things that have artistic and interesting value, right? It feels odd to say it, but being a cultured person will make you a better GM. So get out there, do new things, try new stuff. If you want an excuse to do it, find a connection between the campaign you're running or the campaigns you might be running and the thing, but get out there and do it. You will find that it has improved you dramatically. So why do we feel the need to prep, right? What is it that makes this a unique job for the game master? Why don't we just get to close the book and go home? So most of the reason that I think that people prep for games, and I say this as someone who enjoys prep, but also likes being able to cast it aside. I think most of the reason that people prep, the game masters have to do this work, is because we want to feel confident that our game will run smoothly, right? We want to feel like the drama and the narrative of the in-the-moment game won't get interrupted because we're not ready with an answer, because we don't have an idea for the next thing to happen. We prep to provide ourselves a framework of certainty in which to operate so that we don't feel like a jerk for ruining the game, right? That can be a very real feeling, and I think that this is something that a lot of new game masters struggle with, where they will over-prepare. And I've got some really good advice around that coming up, and not just from me, but some advice from some designers that I think will really help you if you're in that place. If you find that you are doing hours and hours of homework to try to make it so that when you are playing, you have the right answer, I think we can talk about letting go, because that's a big part of becoming a more practiced game master, is doing the right amount of prep for you. I think that we also prep as a means to make sure we connect with the ongoing narrative of our game, with its world. Prep isn't a one-and-done event. It's not done exclusively at the beginning of a campaign and then just harvested for content as we play. It's something that we do every time we close the book and go home. The prep process begins at the end of the session and it ends at the beginning of the next session, and we continue to do it as we move through our campaign. We're going to be adjusting our prep. We're going to be checking in with it. It's a way to ensure that not only do we know where we're at and that the ship of the game is headed in the right direction, but a way to feel connected to that, to ask ourselves questions and to build on the answers for our own benefit as game masters, right? We prep to stay in contact with our narrative. And I think lastly, we prep because the game that we play demands it. Right? Either the players need a dungeon to explore, and we damn well better show up with one, or the vampire coterie needs rivals to do battle with, or the game itself is a specific set of rules, like the town in Dogs in the Vineyard, that we have to follow to play the game correctly. Right? Prep is often something that is either explicitly or implicitly required by the game that we play. So what do we do to prep? What do we need to have before us when we go into our game, right? To fulfill our goal as the game master, we have to understand what sort of things might be useful to us, right? It's fairly straightforward. Given that narratives of all sorts contain the same elements, these are not going to be revolutionary concepts. You're going to look at these and say, well, yes, of course. But there are a few things in no particular order that I think that we should think about when we prepare. And there's certainly things that are on my mind when we go in. So setting is crucial to your adventure. Setting is something that nobody but you as a game master has control over. Now, the players may be able to affect the setting, right? Luke can blow up the Death Star, right? The players can destroy the City of Brass through their actions, but the setting belongs to you. You are offering it up to the players. And so you want it to be the most interesting and developed in a useful way object of your prep, right? Because setting helps you understand not only the physical location in which the game exists, but the rules of fiction that apply to that place, right? The kinds of people that might occupy it, what might happen there. I chose an image over there, an image of Sigil, the setting of Planescape. It's a city on the inside of a ring, kind of like Halo. And I chose this image because if you were to just say you're in the city of Sigil, I would assume that it is a city like any other. But there is something special about this location, right? A creepy manor is a very different place from the engine room of a starship, but they both might have ghosts. Often, prepping where your game takes place can lead you to a better understanding of what else is going on. The spirit of the place informs everything that happens in it. A good narrative contains characters, right? And by this I mean there's a cast of dramatis personae appropriate to your game that you have an understanding of who they are and how they relate to one another. These are the individual nodes of that relationship map that we saw before. Preparing an NPC might mean that you're creating an entire stat block in the same way you might create a PC, or creating truncated ones based on the game you're playing and whether it has rules for quick characters or the like. Right? This is that Prince noble stat block we talked about before. It might just mean understanding the people that are around the PCs and what they want vis-a-vis the player characters. Now, I included NPCs as the second option after, right, the second topic after location, because I think that both the physical location that the players are in, right, that their characters are in, and the NPCs that are around them both exhibit elements of setting. If you watch the shows that I run, you'll notice that NPCs don't just exist to exist, right? It's not just a random person with random desires just hanging around. For me, NPCs are a fundamental way to get the themes of the game across, right? If there is a game in which religious persecution exists, characters will belong to the persecuting religion. They will belong to the people being persecuted. They will have opinions, thoughts, and feelings about those core themes in your game, and they will live in the setting, and the setting itself will be reflective of those themes. So NPCs do not simply stand alone. A wizard is not just a wizard. A lot of this for me follows from Vincent Baker's advice in Apocalypse World to make every NPC real. And we'll talk about making good NPCs closer to the end. The third thing you need setting, you need NPCs, and you need a situation, right? Now, situation is the most ephemeral thing you're going to prep for, but it's also the most important, in my mind at least. Now, situation isn't the plot of the game, right? This isn't the chapters that will lead through rising action to the climax of your game. The situation is action. The situation is an unignorable object. The situation might be a premise, but it's more alive than that, right? Prepping your situation for your game encompasses asking and answering questions like, what has happened to get us to this place? And what might happen next? How will the PCs change this situation? And most importantly, why should we care about this? And it gives context, meaning, and fundamental momentum, which is crucially important to gameplay, to everything else that you prep. Without a situation, the NPCs and the setting are a still painting. And you are not a painter. You are a game master. So you need momentum, you need energy. The situation kicks things into action. Some additional commentary on situation, and certainly the first place I ever saw situation described comes from Luke Crane, the designer of The Burning Wheel, which, as you probably know, is my favorite role-playing game. And I think it explains situation in a way that was really revelatory for me as a game master, right? Checking in on what the situation is helps me keep my game going. There always has to be a situation, and that situation should be informed by and should inform the rest of your prep. Now, if you're already running a game at home, and I mean this in a very literal sense, you who's listening to this right now, if you're running a game at home, what is your situation? How has the situation changed since you started your campaign? Did you offer the situation up at the beginning and it hasn't changed and the players are still handling that situation? Or is this something that has evolved over time? Unignorable momentum. So how much of this do we need to do? How much time should we spend prepping? 10 minutes? An hour? 8 hours? Does it matter based on the game we're playing? How do we know how much prep to do? So another designer that I deeply respect has some advice on this. Now, in revised Stars Without Number, Kevin Crawford, who writes games that could take thousands of hours to prep for. If you were to roll every single planet and then roll every single culture on every single planet, and the places that every single person on that planet lived, and then build a sector out of that by hand, one at a time at the very beginning of your game, you would be doing it for hours and hours and hours. You never actually get any play in. So Kevin gives this advice right smack in the middle of a game where it's your job to create an entire universe of planets, moons, cities, people, adventure hooks, excitement, drama, much of which, if you were to do that, the players would simply never encounter, but for whom the threat of their encountering lies over your head like the sword of Damocles every single session, right? In a game of Stars Without Number, the players could go literally anywhere at any given time, and you damn well better be prepared. So Kevin gives us this very good advice. because it's a great metric when you're in the midst of prep, right? It's not about bailing out because the prep you're doing isn't entertaining you, but it's giving yourself permission to follow what is driving your passion in prep, right? If you want to prep more, listen to what Kevin has to say and indulge yourself, right? This is about saying, are you having a good time? If so, keep doing it, right? So how do we know if we're prepping enough? Well, Kevin follows with some good advice about that too. So often we can get hooked into the curse of world building. Now, I hate world building. I hate it as a concept. I think it reinforces the GM as novelist. We'll talk about world building later, and I will tell you all about why I think it's a dangerous concept for game masters. But I think that Kevin's advice here is incredibly useful for maintaining good mental health during prep. Look at what is fictionally possible for the characters, right? Do the characters have horses? Do they have boats? How far can their spaceship travel? Look at what's directly in front of them. Are they going to get into a big fight in the next session? Understanding the pacing of your game and your player's play style can give you a distinct edge on determining how much prep you should be doing. If you're doing prep now for things that you're not going to see for another 8 sessions, you're doing yourself a disservice because you're definitely going to change some of that stuff. And you're doing your players a disservice because you're assuming you have any idea what their whims are going to be like 8 sessions from now. That could be months. You might not even have the same players by then. If you don't need it tomorrow or whenever your next session is, don't prep that stuff. Now, it's easy to say this when I have a good fundamental understanding of the games that I'm playing and the kinds of events that occur in those games. But if you're starting your game, that's a whole nother matter. Or if you're just getting used to GMing, that can be a whole nother matter. And we'll talk about that. Golden rule for prep, right? This has always been true for me, and I likely think it always will be. Nothing matters if we do not see it at the table. If you are not engaging with your players about a thing, it is irrelevant. Now, Adam, you're saying, well, what about the kingdoms that I've built? What about the tribes of orcs? What about the cults and the religions and the axis of the planet and the calendars that I've built? And what about all of this world building? Certainly that must matter. It motivates the characters. It places them in a world with context. Yes, it's okay to think about those things. And again, remember Kevin's advice, if you're enjoying it, keep doing it, but do not let it become your driving passion, because what is on screen is the only thing that is real for a game. Tie the things you are curious about to something. If you care about something, bring it forward, put it on stage. Because if you don't, it'll just be in the background forever, and your campaign will die without you ever having gotten to express what is the best about it in your mind. When I feel passionate about something, when I'm like, oh, I've just had a great idea, I will go as far out of my way as I need to find an excuse to show it to my players, because that makes it real. It's something they can interact with. It doesn't matter, for example, if the town mayor is secretly a member of some fringe religion, unless that religious aberration is tied to the narrative and you can bring it forward onto the screen in some form or another. Prepping just in case, or prepping things that will never leave the background, prepping for backstory is tempting, especially if you follow a campaign setting or expect your prep to be like a campaign setting. Don't. But if that's what you expect out of play, it can be very tempting to do that. And maybe it'll give you some small inspiration, but you don't need to spend hours detailing the religious practices of every secret cult if you're never even going to meet the mayor, right? Now, Kevin has one last good piece of advice for us about fun and prep and what that looks like. And I hope that you'll take it to heart. Too often, we assume that in order to fulfill our Gygaxian responsibility as game master, we have to know every possible thing. And to know everything, we have to have premeditated answers ready to unleash, just in case the players take a hard detour to some random town and we know the mayor is in the middle of some ritual to a weird secret god whose cult we have 20 pages of backstory on, just in case the players asked. Now, it seems cool to be that prepared, right? We love being the answer person, right? I love when chat says to me, wait a second, how did you have so much detail on something you couldn't have known the players, couldn't have possibly imagined that the players were going to investigate or be interested in? That's amazing. You're the best. We want that. We want to feel like our players recognize that. We feel like we're being seen for that stuff. But honestly, 99% of my game mastering is well-prepared bullshit. It's improvised, but it's improvised with a set of tools underneath that improv to make it easier for me to make up that BS as we go. And I'll share some of those tools with you. That's why you're here. But for now, all that matters, fundamentally all that matters when you're building NPCs, you're creating places, you are expanding upon your situation, all that matters is that the prep brings you joy. Now, we joke as game masters, right? We joke about prep being homework, and sometimes it feels like homework, but I want prep to feel exciting. I want prep to feel like an excuse to be indulgent, right? To think about our world that we're building and to become excited about it. I want that to be a driver of passion. If you're doing prep right now, if you're doing prep and you hate it, stop. If your prep always feels like work, if you dread doing GM prep, stop it entirely. Try doing something else. Nothing about playing a role-playing game should feel bad. We play games because they're interesting, because they're engaging, not because they're boring, right? So if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, that when I have to prep, I hate it. I hate doing prep. I hate designing dungeons. I hate filling out maps. I hate having to do all this work just so I can feel prepared. Maybe play a different game. Maybe don't be the GM. Take a break. Prep should feel like fun, right? It should give you energy, not take it away. Many games do a poor job of telling us what prep entails. Many games just leave prep in the hands of the GM, assuming that you're going to figure out what you need to do without any guidance. They assume that each GM will just have their own techniques that they learned from, I don't know, the collective unconscious, and you will use those techniques to shape and manage your campaign. And yes, that can be very freeing when a game doesn't tell you what to do, but honestly, if you don't already know what to do, it can be incredibly frustrating. You can open a book, you can flip through the Dungeon Master's Guide, and you can find all kinds of interesting things about what types of society you could build, or how to make a monster, or how to choose a magic item, right? There's tables. Some of that stuff is very useful, but the moment-to-moment of prep, like what do I need to do today at the end of my session to be ready for the next session, can often be unclear. So here's a general way that I suggest that you think about prep and how to structure it. It assumes that you're going to be playing a long-term campaign of the same game in more or less the same group. This framework isn't really apply to one-shots, but it can be useful for a mini-series as well. So here's how I break it down. We start at the top with the biggest container, the thing that holds everything that you're doing, and we call that the campaign. Now, a campaign is everything from character creation all the way through to the conclusion of play, when you are done playing the game. It is a long commitment of time and energy, and when you refer to the campaign, it might mean that you played with the same folks or different ones, but usually it's the same game with an ongoing narrative featuring, at the very least, a similar setting and similar themes, though the situation itself might change. Now, you can't really prep for a campaign, right? You can prep to begin a campaign. You can prep for a first session, but you can't sit down and say, I will make the campaign be like this from the beginning to the end. Overarching themes? Good. Prep those. Be like, I would like this campaign to be about loyalty. I would like this campaign to be set in Dragonlance, right? The thing is, prep demands flexibility. Campaigns take a long time, so you kind of can't have both. So don't prep too much for your campaign, right? It's an artifact of play. You'll look back at your campaign. Often, when people say, my campaign is going to be about ... what they really mean is the first situation and overarching premise in which the action of my games will take place is ... Now, you break a campaign down into, to use the parlance of Dungeons and Dragons, adventures. You can think of an adventure like a season of a TV show, right? Now, a campaign is large and broad and mostly the product of play after the fact. Adventures are more tightly constrained, and they are usually between 5 and 20 sessions, though it'll depend on how complex they are. Preparing for an adventure is about the most work any given bit of prep can be, right? And while you can do a lot of it up front, there are more flexible ways to plan an adventure that we'll talk about later. In D&D, an adventure might contain a single dungeon, right? The Tomb of Horrors, God help us, is an adventure. But it might also contain overland exploration part in the first act, a dangerous lost city in the second act, and a mega dungeon in the third act. And that's an adventure too. They're different sizes of adventure. We'll talk about pre-built adventures, right? Adventure modules a little bit later. But you got your campaign. Your campaign is made up of arcs or seasons or serieses that we'll call, for the purposes of this lecture, adventures. And then those adventures are made up of sessions. And the session is the fundamental, most important aspect of role-playing, right? The session is where all the good shit happens. The session is the thing you want to prep for. Mine are usually about 4 hours of play with a break in the middle, but yours might be shorter or longer. The game will tell you sometimes, if it's helpful, it'll tell you some useful hints about that. Prepping for a session is ultimately all you really ever need to do. You don't actually have to prep for adventures. You don't have to prep for a campaign. You just need to know, like Kevin admonished us before, what do I need for the next session? Having an idea of what might happen before the weekly game, readying any mechanical stuff that you need, organizing your notes, and then sitting down to play, right? If you can prep a session, you can prep for an adventure by stringing those prep sessions together. You can prep for an adventure by stringing all of that together into a campaign. And you can see here how, instead of thinking big and working small, start small. What do I need tomorrow? What do I need for that session? Now, sometimes that can be hard, right? Sometimes players might go off in a random direction, narratively or literally, and it can be helpful to prepare multiple options. I find this to be the case when there are a bunch of different things that the players might do, and you need to prep for all of them, or you feel like you do. And I have a secret for you, right? If you have your players in a position where they could go down road A or down road B or get into helicopter C, or they can get into spaceship D, and there are a lot of different things, and you don't know what to prep, and you don't want to prep for 1,000 years before the next session, just in case, I have a secret for you. This is what I do when I'm not sure what the players are going to do. I just friggin' ask them. I just ask. I don't ask in character. There's no tricks. I just say to them as players, hey, so there's a bunch of different stuff that you guys could do. Which way are you leaning for the next session? Which way do you think you are going to go? You don't have to decide now, but like, let's narrow it down so I don't have to prep 17,000 things. This way you don't have to prep a normal session and then 15 what-if sessions. Just ask your players, level with them, let them know there are a lot of potential choices ahead. You're not personally invested in any specific thing, and you'd love to know what they're thinking so you can plan accordingly. It's so weird how often this just works, how often they will just tell you. You can have that one. It's a good trick, just to ask them. Now, you can break sessions down a little further, but I don't think you can prep for these necessarily. An individual set of scenes makes up a session, right? Sometimes a scene is really clearly bounded, like a fight, right? From the point where we start using initiative order until we stop, that's a scene. That's a fight scene. Sometimes a scene is a conversation, right? Where it's like, we walk into the inn, we talk to the innkeeper, we talk to the old man by the fire, we go upstairs, we go to bed. That's a scene, right? The inn is a scene. In some games, scenes last until a mechanism is engaged, right? Sometimes we have specific stuff that says a scene starts when you do this and it ends when you do that, and you can spend points during the scene to adjust it. A lot of the time, what makes up a scene is a lot more ephemeral, though. A lot of the time, what makes up a scene is more driven by feeling. A good way to know what a scene is to look at where it takes place. Usually, if the characters are in a place and they go to a different place, that's two different scenes, right? Now, I love thinking about scenes, even in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, because it helps you with pacing, right? You can say, this scene is over, let's move on to the next one, when it feels like the thing is done. But that's not about prep, right? Let's look at how scenes can influence prep. We're going to look at a piece of prep that I did. We saw this earlier on when I was showing you the maps for a one-shot. A one-shot that is both an adventure, right? Containing a bunch of different stuff. It's also a single session, right? One play session from when we sit down to when we are done, and made up of a bunch of different scenes, which I did prep for. In this one-shot, this Warhammer one-shot, each individual bubble in my map is a scene or a potential scene, right? The whole map makes up my session, and a longer or more complex map could be used to work out a bunch more choices and lead us down different narrative paths, but I prepped a little bit for each thing because I knew how much time I would have. Now, this doesn't mean that I railroaded the players, right? It doesn't mean that these things have to happen, but it's an order of sequence. So if the players enter into the scene and they don't know what is going on, they don't know what to do next, you can say, let's look at this map that I've made, and I'm going to adjust it. We're going to move on to the next scene, right? So if the characters are being addressed by the Lord and Lady of the house, and we don't have anything to do, they're like, well, we don't want to talk to them. We're not sure like how to pursue the mystery. I can say, all right, so the address ends, and the young prince announces that everyone's going to play a game. We're all going to play hide and seek. What fun, right? It helps me move from scene to scene. You can also see how I break it up into multiple options for scenes. And then there are branching areas for various scenes. Now, this is incredibly useful for one-shots or for limited sessions. These bubbles could represent sessions. You don't have to time them necessarily. They can just be events. But this is a way that you can look at scenes. So each of these bubbles is a scene. The whole map is both a session and an adventure, in my case. Now, for a piece of practical advice, I made this map and every other flowchart map that looks like this using a tool called draw.io. That's the name of the tool and the URL at which it lives. It ties into Google Drive, so if you use Google Drive to organize your GM notes, which you should, because it's great and it's free, you can plug draw.io right into it, and then your maps will live alongside your various inspiration images and your doc files and whatever else you do to build out your prep digitally. So draw.io. Now, sometimes I use other tools to help me, like MS Paint, like Microsoft. Listen, I know where my strengths and weaknesses lie. I'm very good at creating NPCs. I can't draw maps, really, but here's one. This is a fantastic map of the cosmology of Court of Swords, featured here, a giant berg. We're going to talk about world building. Now, you remember before I told you I hate world building. I think world building is for novelists. I think world building is for people who want to make cinematic universes. I think that world building is for people whose job it is to create a cogent, static, finished narrative that doesn't have players in it. World building can be fun, and if you want to do it. But I don't think it's a very useful tool for making a campaign setting for a role-playing game. Because 9 times out of 10, world building ignores that most important aspect of GMing, the good situation. I think world building for me is just kind of annoying and not fun, and it leads people to be constricted in their design. That said, we should talk about it because not everybody is me. And we should talk about what world building is or isn't in the context of RPGs. So when you're creating your own setting for a game, you can know what is useful. So what is world building? You're letting me down, Wikipedia. World building is the process of building a world. Yep, that's true. That is very true. In RPGs, world building is the process of creating a place in which the campaign's action will be set, as well as any ongoing conflict and tension in the world that might lead the game's characters to having something interesting to do. Let's talk about Star Wars for a second. So the universe of Star Wars, the setting of Star Wars, inherently, if we think about it just as a bunch of places and rules, right? So, okay, there is a core, and the Galactic Empire lives in the core, and there's a bunch of other planets, and different people live on those planets, and there's some aliens, and there's some trade routes that lead through the universe, and there's the Kessel Run, and there's the Force, and the Force is like magic in this setting, and here's how the Force works, and here's so much information about like how the Force creates its magical effects, and that's the magic system of the game. Done. Boring. Boring, because a galactic empire doesn't mean anything until there are rebels fighting it. Oh, so now there's a war. War is an occurrence. War is a situation. Now we can play Imperial troops trying to fight the rebels. Yeah, or we can play rebel officers trying to command a scrappy band of fighting forces against the evil empire. Now there are things to do for the characters in the game. And this is what I hate about so many campaign settings, is that they're static. It's just like, here's the Forgotten Realms. Here's where a bunch of shit is in the Forgotten Realms. Okay, but like, what is happening there? What do we do as characters within that setting? So if you're going to go into world building, think a little bit, if you're interested in, where the lakes are and where the mountains are or whatever, but think about why that matters. I do not care if there is a lake in this setting. I care about what kind of treasure is hidden under that lake. I care about the monster that lives in the lake. I care about how the lake has an angry god that inhabits and personifies it. I care about the conflict, and I care about the things that gives me to do as a player. Everything in your setting, everything that you are prepping, should offer action. Don't just set up the status quo, except to give the players the opportunity to knock it over. In doing world building, I have the following advice, which I stole from myself. Dungeon World admonishes game masters of that game to fill in with prep whatever interests them, right? Follow your passion, do the Kevin Crawford, make the things in the game world that sound fun and cool to you, right? Draw those maps if that's fun for you. Come up with a religion if you like inventing religions. Do it because it's fun, right? Everything else, just leave blank. Do only the fun stuff, right? Leave room for new ideas, both from yourself and from players. Not only is creating an entire world from top to bottom incredibly draining, your players will neither encounter nor give even the tiniest crap about 99% of it, unless you tie it directly to the campaign as a game. Unless you give them a reason. There's a big difference between there are stormtroopers and a stormtrooper shot your aunt and uncle. You see the difference? I don't care about stormtroopers, but I'm going to go to Alderaan and become a Jedi like my father before me on account of, Baru. It matters, right? Giving the characters something to do and interact with. But you don't have to come up with that all by yourself. You could ask Luke's player, hey, why did you want to become a Jedi? And he'll say, oh, well, so here's the thing. This empire you told me about, they have these crack teams of guys who apparently can't shoot anything, except they killed my aunt and uncle, and that's what drove me to become a Jedi. And you're like, Oh shit, all right, well now I know something about the universe. I left a blank and a player filled that in. Start small, right? Create the place where the game is going to occur initially. Give the game setting somewhere for that situation to happen. Give it an interesting set of moments of conflict, and then leave it there. The only other thing you need to be able to answer is who and what the players are, right? And what they're interested in doing. The game will probably give you some of that. D&D's characters will always be into doing certain things. We talked a little bit about how to figure what that is in the last lecture. The game will likely give you some of that stuff, but here's another trick that helps lower the amount of prep engagement that you have to do. Remember that the world is for the PCs and for them only. Nobody cares if the king of Borgobria is in a blood feud with the high princess of Klosterfrig if the game is not set in Borgobria or Klosterfrig or the borderland between the two, right? Let the PC's decisions during character creation guide you. If you end up with a party interested in certain archetypes, work with them to fill in the details of those archetypes and ask them questions. Let them do some of that work. You're obligated only to create that which your PCs get their grubby little hands on. Nothing more, certainly nothing less. If you want to design more, go for it because it's fun, but don't world build a million details just because you think the players might choose one of them. Organic world building is always better than trying to front load. You're going to burn out. Don't do it. Make only what you need for the players. Building a useful setting requires pretty much just this stuff. Anything else is extra detail. So do this. Think about this when you're going in to build a setting for your game. You're going to build a world, right? The players need to know contextual important information, right? Whatever's right in front of them. Where does the game take place? What is currently going on here? What ties them to this place and situation? There might be 100 cities in your world, but you can only be in the one to begin with. Start with what matters, right? Tell them why this place is important to the campaign. Tell them what the situation is. Let them build characters that are appropriate to that, right? Do not sit down at the table and say, we are playing Dungeons and Dragons. Make characters. Sit down and say, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, and the situation is there's a terrible blood war between two noble houses that is destroying the land. One of the houses has the backing of a vampire lord. The other house is a deeply religious house with an ancient history. You live in the borderland between these two houses' domains. You are freebooters. The war is going on, people are dying, and you are robbing the land. So make badass mercenary types that can survive in that dangerous environment. And this game will be about deciding whether or not you can live off of the rubble of these two forces or whether we're going to have to choose to be loyal to one side or another by the end. Now your players have, there's so much more context than just the player's handbook, right? Give them a premise, give them a situation, give them context. Tell them what's different, right? What have you changed about the core game experience? Are there new options you've added? Are there things you've taken away? Are you like, elves in this world are all blue? I don't know. Let them know. Let them know what to expect because people are going to come to the table with a certain expectation of the genre, right? And this is a way to flatten everyone's expectations because if you sit down with a group of people and you say, we are going to play a fantasy adventure game, one of them is going to think Tolkien. One of them is going to think George R.R. Martin. One of them is going to think Harry Potter. And if you don't give them more information, they're going to make some weird characters that won't make sense. So tell them what's changed. Tell them what to expect. And to that effect, if the campaign prep has changed the rules of the game, right? Like maybe your setting has no gods, let them know, right? Tell them the rules stuff. Tell them if there are spells that work differently. I had this situation come up recently where a character was ascended to a level where they can cast 7th level spells, and now I need to have a conversation with them about how resurrection works in this world, because it's definitely different than it's written in the book, right? Give them the fictional reasons for these changes, and let them note the mechanical, and then just give them something to do. Don't build a static world. Build a world in flux. Or at the very least, build a world with a status quo and get ready to give your players ways to upend that status quo. That's how you get fun, momentum. RPGs are about action. Now, what if you don't want to do all that work? What if all of this so far, you're sitting here thinking, Jesus, Adam, that is a lot. Thankfully, many exciting companies have provided products you can purchase where they do some of that prep for you. Welcome to Abir Toril. I guess like a tiny fraction of Abir Toril. This is Faerun. This is the campaign setting for the Forgotten Realms. A campaign setting is a pre-baked world building session, right? It's maps, it's locations, maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, it's some situations. It's almost definitely a bunch of NPCs, some custom rules. It depends, right? Different campaign settings will do different things, but it can include a lot of little details and can be super useful when you're not really interested in doing world building yourself, or you're already familiar with the IP in which the campaign is already set. Faerun is a campaign setting. Star Wars is a campaign setting. Star Trek is a campaign setting. Far Verona is a campaign setting. Some of them have books. Some of them exist in Wikipedia articles, right? Like, there are a lot of different ways to build a campaign setting. If you have a game that is set in the real world, Chicago is a campaign setting, right? You don't need to buy a book. You can just look at the things that are going on in a real place, right? Now, drawbacks to using an existing campaign setting can be an imbalance in player knowledge. If you've got a huge Trek fan in your group, huge Star Trek fan, playing a game where all of the characters are members of Starfleet can be daunting. You might not want to use an existing campaign setting if you like to hack, change, or add things. Some of these settings can be quite restrictive in your choices, and knowing what's different and what's allowed or what's not allowed can represent a fair bit of work. Talk to your players in advance, especially if you know you have a super fan, right? If you are, for example, going to play a Star Wars game, you better talk to Jesse about, hey, I know that you know a shit ton about Star Wars. Let's talk about what's going to happen when I say something that's different from what you expect, because that can be very trying for people who are already fans of that to be like, actually, Adam, the New Order's banners are in red, black, and white, not red, black, and gray, right? Jesse didn't do that to me because he's a good person, and we had that conversation in advance. He said to me, you know what? It's your campaign setting, man. If you want to go crazy and change things, I am so excited to see your version of Star Wars. So talk about that with your players if you're using a campaign setting, whether it's a fictional one from outside of gaming, or whether it's something like big old Toril here. Also, I didn't realize the Moonshays are so close to the mainland. Anyway, I like campaign settings like this sometimes because it gives you familiarity, right? When I say you see a squadron of TIE fighters come screaming over the mountains, flying towards the rebel base, I bet you I just made you imagine some little bulbs with wings on the side of them, right? Like I think that's something that you can understand, right? Many campaign settings will leave room for a GM to develop them, right? There might be a planet in a corner with nothing on it. I'm thinking like Warhammer RPG does this. They have a planet that's like, this is the setting for the RPG with lots of space for you to design. Maybe there's a country with only a little bit of detail. Forgotten Realms does that. So you can have the best of both worlds. A familiar campaign setting in which the rules are predetermined by decades of novels, but the freedom to create your own stuff within it. And that's cool. So take a look. See if something like that exists if you're tempted to use a campaign setting. Talk to your players, right? Let them know you're playing in a setting or thinking about it and see what they think or what are they interested in. Adventures, or adventure modules, which we talked a little bit about before, are more specific. If a campaign setting represents a pre-built way to populate a whole world, adventures give you scenarios to engage with within that world. Some adventures are a toolkit, right? Elements you can slap together to make something bigger, right? They're building blocks rather than a narrative. Others focus very specifically on plot or location. Now, no adventure is entirely prep-free. For example, the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which I'm running right now, I spend about an hour and a half prepping for each level of the dungeon. That's about how much work it takes to be prepared. Some adventures require more, some require less. They demand that you familiarize yourself at the very least with the adventure, so you have to read it, and some demand or expect customization, right? There's an old Dungeons & Dragons adventure that it's just occurred to me now called In Search of the Unknown, he said uncertainly. I think that's the one. It's a basic adventure. In Search of the Unknown, there's a ton of rooms in the dungeon with nothing keyed to them. You are supposed to fill those out. And if you don't read the adventure, you're going to be like, oh, another empty room. Brilliant. I've had some great times with modules, but the best times are always the result of synthesis of the module's text, my own improvisation and adaptation of that text, and the players themselves bringing new things. If you want to see this in action, I would definitely suggest going and watching a few episodes of that Mad Mage playthrough that I do, because I add a lot to customize the adventure for the players and for their characters, right? If there is, for example, like a death cult, they're not just a death cult, they're Merkelites because one of the players worships Merkel. Well, the player doesn't, her character does. If your players worship a false... Listen, I don't have time to go into religion right now. Modules are a good place to start if you want to learn how to play an RPG, but they're not great to learn how to prep because they do that prep for you. They're training wheels in that way. The best ones give you flexibility, and sometimes learning with training wheels can be helpful. If you find an adventure that gives you flexibility and demands that you do some writing yourself, that's cool. Do that, because that'll teach you how to prep in a smaller environment. The worst adventures are fully fleshed out, inflexible railroads, right? Do your research before you pick one. They're not all good. So from session to session, and this is going to be me sharing my personal tools with you, from session to session, there are a couple of things that I'm going to use to manage my prep, regardless of what game that I'm playing. They help me organize, assemble, and feel ready for a session. Now, none of them are about mechanisms, right? You need to do whatever the game tells you to do mechanically. But these tools can be applied to just about any game to help make your prep better. These are my killer apps for GMing. So the first one, 3-point NPCs. So this is an NPC that you ball up and you throw from farther away from the net, and so you get more points when you... No. Aside from their mechanical details, no NPC should need more than 3 bullet points to define their entire character. I do not care how complex you think they are. I don't care how deep their backstory. 3 points, no more. It can be a combination of emotional, physical, other relevant indicators, but if you have more than 3 bullet points, in addition to whatever goes on their character sheet, you're probably wasting your time, because players will not notice or remember more than 3 things. These things will shift, and their tenor will be different for every campaign that you play, because the things about them that matter will change. But I find that focusing on 3 things not only helps me prep and remember more quickly, but it keeps the NPCs from getting overcomplicated. Because you don't want to be struggling, just like with the world, right? If you build the world too complicated with too much stuff going on, you will not have the time or energy to actually execute in-game. And if you build NPCs and you have 10 of them, and they all have complicated backstories, 99% of that will never make it on screen, right? They'll never show up on stage. So let the PCs be all nuanced and complex. That's what they're here for. This is a game about them. Keeping NPCs simple helps everyone remember them better. Play them with nuance, right? They're not simple in the sense that they're not interesting to play, but prep with aggressive brevity, right? Prep tightly. Here is an example named Yancey. 3 points that matter about an NPC from my Stars Without Number game from Far Verona. Yancey is an entitled nobleman who cracks under real pressure, but somehow has managed to become a superior officer. That's all I need to know about him. Every action he takes is related to those 3 things. Every reaction to everything every PC has ever done, those 3 things. That is it. You can change them as you go, but do not prep any more than 3 things about any given NPC, again, outside of whatever stats the game demands. As far as NPCs go, this is my second big trick. Before any session of any game, especially games that have a bunch of NPCs, I will sit down and I will write down a list of all of the NPCs. Now, I don't just mean people, right? I mean people, I mean monsters, I mean important organizations, and I will write down a list of all of their names, right? So I'll have a list of everybody that I think will be relevant to this session. Next to that list, I will write down in the next column, you can do it on a spreadsheet. In the next column, I will write, what do they want, right? What does this character want today? What is their goal in today's session, right? What does Gun Princess want today? If we interact with her, what will she be driving towards? And in a third column, I will write down what they will use to get it. So it might be like, Gun Princess wants Berg's attention and will use violence to get it. And now I know I can insert a scene where Gun Princess picks a fight to impress Berg. Right? These are things that I can do to help me know if a character is in a scene during the session, what are they going to try to do? Most NPCs will not have time to do more than one thing. 3 columns. NPC name, what do they want? How are they going to get it? Right? Between this and the 3 things rule, that's all you need for NPCs. You never need anything else. I try to prep NPCs who are in some way opposed to my players' characters. Now, they don't have to be like, I want to kill Ramus, but maybe they want to get in the way. Maybe they want the same thing and they're competing. Maybe they accidentally are opposed, right? Maybe they're just bumbling and that slows the players down. If the players want things, the most important NPCs are the ones that are going to engage with them about those things. So this is a way to create antagonism in your game. So figure out what your player characters want and tailor your NPCs to interact with those desires or with them directly. Because again, an NPC who's operating off screen, who never wants the same things as the players, is irrelevant. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to only have NPCs that are on screen matter. You can have NPCs the characters never meet who continue to screw with them. Again, using the Star Wars example, think about how many characters in Star Wars, right? 3PO, R2, Han, Chewie, Vader, Luke, Boba Fett. I'm just going to keep listing them. All of those characters are influenced by the desires and machinations of the Emperor, right? The Galactic Emperor sitting on his throne. Now, only Luke, I guess, and Darth Vader, if you consider him a PC. There's a lot of PvP in this version of Star Wars. Only Luke interacts directly with the Emperor. But the Emperor's actions, right? Palpatine gets up to a lot of stuff that affects the other PCs in the game, even if they don't ever realize it. So, for example, if the Emperor wants to destroy the rebellion, right? That's a big, broad goal. You could say his tool is to, his means to accomplish that is to send Lord Vader to put Luke Skywalker in carbonite, right? His control over Darth Vader, his control over the Imperial Legions, all of that stuff is how he accomplishes snuffing out the rebellion. Now, that's not very intimate. It's quite broad and quite far away. But then when you make Darth Vader wants to convert his son. How does he do that? Showing him the power of the dark side, right? Motivation directly opposed to a PC, or at the very least, orthogonal with the PC's desires. This guy's my favorite, though. Like, in terms of building a world and not having to build everything about the world and having that world feel like it's moving, fronts. Stolen directly from Apocalypse World and Dungeon World, fronts are a tool that I use in any game where I want the world to feel like it has momentum, where it's moving along. One of my favorite things to prep is more danger and more threats than the PCs can ostensibly handle at once. If there's a town that's in danger, it's probably under threat from more than one thing at a time. Maybe the witch cursed the town. Maybe a nearby goblin camp is getting bigger. Maybe a terrible winter is coming. Each one of those things could result in woe and destruction if the PCs don't stop it, and the characters will have to make a meaningful decision about which thing to pursue. These are, in reality, just bullet lists about the bad thing. Let's detail the witch. So before the players arrive in town, I know that the mayor said something mean to the Witch of the Woods. She's deeply insulted, and now she's sworn revenge. Each bullet point is a step between here and there, between her revenge and now. As time passes in the narrative, the witch is allowed to continue. These things happen until we arrive at the end. If the players interfere, they could prevent or alter the path of this front. In some cases, they could win their battle with the front altogether. I make these lists to begin imagining what would happen if the PCs just never arrived. So if the PCs never arrived, the witch does a bunch of bad things and then the village burns. She gets her revenge. Sometimes I will leave gaps and I'll insert new things. Sometimes a front will get longer or shorter. Other times I will leave gaps at the beginning, right? I'll just say, at the end, the village burns. Let's figure out what the witch does as the players interact with them. You don't have to design the entire list. I'll usually have a handful of fronts going at once, depending on how complex the game is. A one-shot will just have one, probably. An ongoing campaign will have a lot. And any given adventure might have 2 or 3. And each front represents an amalgamation of creatures, events, organizations, and things in the world with an agenda and clear ideas about progress to that agenda. The players get to decide what to engage with and what to leave for tomorrow. And all the things they leave behind continue to advance. So if you're like me, you do not have a lot of time for prep. Part of doing prep better is doing less of it. If you can't come up with a whole adventure from start to finish, you don't want to publish an adventure, which you shouldn't be trying to do unless that's the goal, right? Don't try to write an entire adventure module before you start your game. You want to do a better job adapting and operating on the fly at the table. Now, this isn't a lecture about giving up prep altogether. There are disciplines and common knowledge out there. If you Google improv and RPGs, you're going to get a lot of different advice. But I'll say this. This next thing is probably my most important piece of advice if you want to do less prep, which I consider to be doing better prep. Come to the session asking what kind of cool stuff might happen today. Let the players surprise you. A big part of over-preparing is that we can rob ourselves of that excitement, that glee of not knowing. Why should the players be the only ones that get surprised? Don't overdo it on the world building. Don't put too much energy into having all the answers. Instead, learn to ask interesting questions. Have a general idea about what is true in your world. Know what is relevant for the upcoming session, but always ask questions. And when you prep, instead of just sitting down to work out everything that will occur, invest your energy in wondering what might happen. What will the PCs do when they meet the witch for the first time? What will they think of the villagers? Will the PCs ally with the werewolves, or will they join the crusade of the Sun Queen? I find good questions and an inquisitive spirit are a lot more useful than world building and an encyclopedic knowledge of your campaign setting. So let's talk about questions that you might have for me. Right? Now we leave a little room at the end of our session to answer questions. Now, I saw one in chat, and if there are more, feel free to post them up now. But Leoveg asked, what about tools like sectors without number, random tables for generating campaign settings? I love them. I love them because all they do is force you to ask questions, right? If you generate randomly a world that is like a volcano planet, and the volcano planet's tags are cyber communism and zombie world, your job as the game master, my job as the game master, is to figure out what in the hell that looks like and what could be going on that planet if the characters go to it. So like I was saying at the end of the lecture, those are more to me question generators than answer generators, right? They give you things to think about in a very specific context. They say to you, here are a few bits and pieces. Your job now is to figure out how they link up. So I think they're very useful tools. They can be used at the beginning Like with Sectors Without Number, you click a button, bam, whole universe. Awesome. Then you can tweak it and tailor it. Or here's a good trick, right? You can generate the whole universe all at once if you want, but if the game gives you tools for randomly generating things, you can randomly generate them one at a time. So you can say, our adventure begins on planet A, and planet A has tags B and C. Planet A is adjacent to some other planets, but I don't know what they are yet, right? It's Schrodinger's planet. Until you visit the planet, you cannot know if it's full of zombie cats. So generate them as you go. Generate them when the players arrive. Sometimes, and sometimes you can do this very quickly. Other times you want to like take a break and be like, all right, everybody, we're headed for planet B. Let's pause here. Everybody take a break. Go get a drink. I'm going to quickly generate planet B. So yeah, I love them. I think they absolutely have a fit. And also, random tables create setting as much as a campaign setting does. Even if you don't roll every event or everything on the table, what is possible is a form of campaign setting. So Deltorin asked, do you think random tables for encounters work better than having a set monster dedicated to a specific area for an encounter? I mix and match them. Yeah. I mix and match. I think that random encounters are good early on. Static encounters that derive from those random tables are better later. So if the players go out into the wilderness and they could run into a goblin, an orc, a minotaur, a cultist, and a zombie, use a random table. But if they run into 2 or 3 zombies in a row, maybe this area is infested with zombies. Maybe there's a cursed graveyard. Maybe there's a necromancer. Bam, now we got a front, right? Build it out of patterns. Use the human apophenia to your advantage. Patterns that develop from rolling on random encounter tables can be used to create setting. And that's super cool, right? That's one way that I've used random encounters in that way. Also, again, random encounters are a way to say what is possible to be true, right? If you're in a swamp, you're saying things about the swamp by generating a random encounter table. So it's like kind of a fun experience anyway. It's a nice way to narrow down the like, you could encounter literally anything to you will probably encounter one of these 20 things. Ken asked, in terms of setting up a world for the PCs, how do we handle balance dangers in the world in a way that maintains a sense of realism for the setting? For example, if we're running Shadowrun set in Seattle, but none of the PCs have made characters that can engage in the Matrix, do the Matrix threats no longer exist? It depends on the game. Some games expect you to engage with that stuff, but I feel like if I was playing Shadowrun and nobody made a Matrix character, I would just have hacking go on in the background. Especially in Shadowrun, you can give other NPCs the skills the players don't have, and then they can, for a cost, engage with that NPC and buy them to do that work for them. It's a really great way to elide the bullshit you don't want in the game, right? So you could be like, in this game, I want to tell a story about religious acolytes struggling against their enemies. Now, yeah, there are warlocks and wizards in the game, but I would prefer if everybody made clerics, paladins, and fighters. Now, if you need a wizard, you can get at them, but they're not part of this story. It's like how Conan works. There is magic in Conan, right? There are sorcerers and Stygian necromancers, but the stories are never about them. Sometimes Conan fights them. Maybe he'll meet and engage with a sorceress, but they're never the main characters of the story. So I think that you can move them away and not put those threats in place, because that's bad GMing, right? If you say, all right, everybody, you're a street samurai and you're a rigger and you're a mage. So to be able to accomplish this next mission, you absolutely 100% have to hack a computer. Right? That's just bad prep. You've prepped generically when you should be prepping specifically. But if you want to keep those threats, make them optional. Make them a challenge. You can say, if you had Matrix skills, you could do this. Maybe you want to find someone who does, who can help you. And then you get to tie in an NPC and what they want, and it can complicate their life. And then you make them buy things. This is what games that have connect or circles roles are for, right? Find someone who can do the job you need done so you don't have to do it yourself. That way the world maintains its verisimilitude of danger and threat, and then you can let the players tune in for other stuff. And they can buy characters that way. So in regards to scene pacing, is another question. If the PCs have decided to stumble into scenes we haven't played out, is there an obligation for the GM to advance the scene? I mean, you don't want to tell the players, like, no, we can't do this because I haven't prepped for it. But you can say, like, hold on a second. Let me prep a little bit for this. We'll come back to it, right? Call for a break. You have the ability to do this at home that I don't on screen. I can't just be like, all right, well, we've been playing for 10 minutes. I need a break to prep this thing, right? But you could ostensibly do that at home. Make that a comfortable part of play if that's something you need to do. But honestly, like, there's no reason to push out of, like, if the players are all having a good time in a scene you didn't prep for and is just like feels like fluff or bullshit, there's lots of room in role-playing games for bullshit, right? That can be fun. This is how we get inter-PC romance in games where it doesn't belong. This is where we get, like, I sing the song of my people to the other characters while we're at camp. Because you're like, this is boring and it doesn't matter. But the players are offering you up an opportunity to, like, pay attention to them and to see what they're interested in and to learn about their characters so that you can later threaten them with more personalized danger. I think it's absolutely fine to just hang out in bullshit land. But if you're not having fun, and that's happening too often, don't feel like you have to do that forever. But don't use your GM skill to do that, right? Address it with the players. Say to them, hey, friends, I noticed we're doing a lot of, like, bullshit freeform RP, but I sat down here to play Dungeons & Dragons, and I made you this dungeon, and if you guys don't want to play D&D, can we switch games, and I don't have to be the GM anymore? Like, I'm not having fun with this. So if you don't mind it, and you're enjoying it, that's totally fine, right? So for Deltoran asked, if for a character like Azure Vortex, did she follow the 3 points rule even as she grew with Berg, or is there wiggle room to add more? Azure Vortex was never ever any more than 3 points to me, but those points changed, right? She didn't start with the point in love with Berg, but I added that as we played, right? So it was like aloof monk, protector of the artifact, devout water genasi, and then I adjusted what was important. Now, just because something isn't a key point doesn't mean it's not still true, right? Like, if I stopped caring about the fact that she was a genasi, it wouldn't make her a human all of a sudden, right? She wouldn't default back. It's just that's not relevant. It doesn't matter as much to her character design. So don't think of the 3 points as being permanent. Think of them in the same way you think of all of your prep. Think of them as all that matters about them for this session. And if that changes, change your 3 points, right? I find it to be really useful. And like fronts and the 3 points rule and all that stuff, to be flexible about it. Like, let yourself bend and change as you progress through the campaign. And then you'll have better NPCs. And people change. Even people who aren't really people, like NPCs. So cool. I think that's good for today's session. Obviously, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Hit me up on Twitter. Leave a comment in the Patreon video when it goes live on Patreon. Or maybe you're watching it on Patreon now. Throw a comment down there, and we'll try to address them. Maybe I'll answer them in the next lecture. As with before, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for backing the RollPlay Patreon. This has been lecture number 3, Better Prep, and I hope that it's helped you. We'll see you next month for session number 4. Bye, everybody.